So what's the real secret to a happy marriage today? I mean, we're told over and over that it's all about a perfect 50-50 split, on everything. But what if the actual data and what people really choose in their own lives tells a totally different story? All right, let's get into it.
Okay, so let's start with the story. Meet Macarena Gomez Barris. I mean, on the surface, she had it all. A fantastic career as a sociology professor, a couple of kids, and a marriage that, started with that instant chemistry. She was a proud feminist, and her husband, Roberto, actually took on the main role at home. It really seemed like the perfect, modern role-reversing partnership.
But, and here's where it gets interesting, Macarena realized she just wasn't comfortable with that setup. Her words were, someone had to care about making money. And so, she ended up leaving her sensitive, stay-at-home husband for someone she described as the most take-charge person I'd ever met. So you see this huge gap, right, between her public beliefs and her private choices.
And look, Macarena's story isn't just some random anecdote. It really raises this massive question that cuts right to the heart of what men and women are looking for these days. What is really going on behind the closed doors of modern relationships?
For decades, the main idea we've all been sold is something the source material calls blank slate feminism. And the core of it is this, the belief that men and women are fundamentally the same and that the ultimate goal, the key to happiness, is a perfect 50-50 split of absolutely everything, work, chores, childcare, you name it.
And this isn't some fringe idea, right? Influential thinkers, like the historian Stephanie Kuntz, have really championed this view. They've suggested that the key to marital happiness is, it's moving away from any kind of traditional roles. The goal, as we're told, is a completely egalitarian partnership, period.
So, the message from our culture is often pretty blunt, isn't it? It's that those traditional roles, a man is the main breadwinner or a protector, are not just outdated, but maybe even harmful. The narrative is that women in those kinds of relationships, they're probably miserable, struggling with depression, anxiety, the whole 9 yards.
But is that really the whole story? Because when you start to look at what people actually do and what they say makes them happy behind the scenes, a much more complicated, more nuanced picture starts to emerge.
Okay, let's take Caitlin, for example. Here's a 32-year-old patent lawyer from Atlanta, a Biden voter, definitely progressive. But when you ask her what she wanted in a husband, her number one answer wasn't about splitting chores 50-50. Nope, it was ambition. And she also says she values that her husband is strong and confident.
Or how about Grace's story? This is pretty intense. She and her boyfriend at the time, John, were on the subway late one night when someone started harassing them. And John, without a second's hesitation, stood right up, put himself between Grace and the guy and just yelled until they were safe. For Grace, that was a huge turning point. That protective instinct, it was, in her own words, huge.
And see, these aren't just touching stories. The data actually backs this up. A survey from 2022 found something pretty remarkable. Wives who rated their husbands as very masculine weren't just happier in their marriage. They were also significantly less likely to even see divorce as a possibility.
And it doesn't stop there. Take a look at this. For married mothers, their happiness is powerfully linked to their husband's job status. I mean, check out these numbers. 74% say they're very happy when their husband works full-time, but that number takes a nosedive if he's only working part-time or worse is unemployed. It's pretty clear. The provider role, it still really matters.
All right. So it's starting to look like these more traditional masculine traits are still pretty important, right? But hold on, this isn't about going back to the 1950s, not at all, because these classic traits, they're only half of the equation for happiness today.
Let's go back to Caitlin, the lawyer who valued ambition so much. Well, she also has very modern expectations when it comes to emotional connection. She talks about needing her husband to be present, having good days of phones down, focusing on real conversations that aren't all about work.
So, what happens if you only have one side of that coin? Let's say a husband is a fantastic provider, but he's emotionally checked out, he's just not attentive.
And what about the flip side? What if he's super attentive, totally emotionally engaged, but he just can't seem to hold down a job and be that provider for the family?
But what happens when a husband manages to be both? When he's a great provider and he's emotionally present? Well, this is where the data shows us something absolutely incredible.
Okay, this is the kicker. Just look at this chart. That top bar says it all. A truly mind-blowing 95%, 95, of wives who say their husband is both a good provider and very attentive also report being very happy in their marriage. It turns out that specific combination is the most powerful predictor of a wife's happiness, hands down.
And when you break it down even further, you see some really interesting patterns. For both husbands and wives, feeling loved and respected, yeah, that's right up there at the top. But then look at number 3. For wives, it's having a good breadwinner. For husbands, it's having a wife who is sexually responsive. So while there's a ton of overlap, some of these key differences are still very much there.
But this is where the story takes a really fascinating turn. Because a strange contradiction pops up when you look at who is actually living these different family models. It kind of reveals this pattern of, well, talking left while walking right. This chart right here is just so telling. The very people who are most likely to publicly say the male breadwinner model is outdated, the elite, upper-income folks, they're the ones who are least likely to actually have a female breadwinner in their own house, only 15%. But then you look at the poorest families, and that number just skyrockets to 73%, and it's usually out of pure necessity, not some ideological choice.
So, where does all this lead us? Well, the source material puts a name to it, the neo-traditional model. And look, it's not a throwback to the 1950s, but it's definitely not blank slate feminism either. Think of it as a hybrid. It's a marriage that still values those classic masculine roles, like being a provider and a protector, but it mashes them together with very high, very modern expectations for emotional connection and being a true partner at home.
So, let's just wrap this up with the key takeaways. What we've seen is that wives seem to be happiest when their husbands are both good providers and emotionally attentive. A man's full-time job is strongly linked to his wife's happiness and just how stable the marriage is. Those classic masculine traits, like being a protector, they still seem to be really appealing. In the end, it's this neo-traditional blend of old and new expectations that the source material points to as the secret sauce for a successful marriage today.
The source ultimately lands on calling this a family-first model, right? Where both the husband and wife are expected to be all in at home. But it also points out a real tragedy here. This super successful model seems to be most available to the very same elites who publicly reject it, while it's least available to the people who might need it the most. And that leaves us with a big question to chew on. In a world that's sending us all these conflicting messages, what does a truly family-first approach actually look like for our relationships today?